So, since last week, when all the stuff went down with the Capitol, I've been thinking a lot about how we got here, specifically how Christianity got so caught up in everything that happened. I wrote an article about it, but you can only say so much when you've got like an 850 word limit. So, I want to spend a little more time diving into it with all of you here right now. Now, before we go in, though, I need to clarify a few things. After the article was posted, a good chunk of people reached out to me to compare what happened to the Capitol to the riots that happened earlier this year. I got lots of people saying, how can you say it was wrong to break into the Capitol? Isn't it the same as people rioting earlier this year with BLM? Why is it wrong now, but not wrong then? And I think that's a fair question, but I actually didn't support the violence that came from those protests either. I'm actually more like an Anabaptist in the fact that I think nonviolence has to be the default mode for Christians. And so the main people that I was writing about were the ones who went beyond just peaceful protesting and started breaking and entering and looting. Also, another big reason I didn't bring up the BLM protests, or riots if you'd rather call them that, in the article is because by and large, the people weren't carrying Bibles or signs that said Jesus saves. There were obviously some Christians who marched in the summer, but the marches weren't Christian in nature. And I saw lots of tweets of people saying, if you're a Christian and you want to march, don't make it about witnessing or being a light. Just be there to support people of color. So those felt more like a social justice movement rather than a Christian movement. But this past Wednesday felt different exactly because it felt like a religiously motivated march. I don't know if you saw, but there were protesters in Michigan who were trying to show solidarity with what was happening in DC, and they actually put up a big cross in front of the Michigan Capitol building. You didn't see that this summer. Now, of course, there were some bad faith actors involved on Wednesday, instigators like we saw earlier this year whose main motivation was to stir people to violence. But by and large, I think that the most of the people there honestly thought that they were fighting for both democracy and for Christianity. My friend Taylor wrote a post and tried to explain what was going on in the minds of the people. And he said, you saw a lot of Christian and Jesus signs because these are people who are terrified of what democratic leadership will do to our religious freedom. They've shown that they'll cancel church services across the country during this pandemic. So who knows what they'll do to our churches if they control the White House, Senate, and the House during and after a pandemic. I think there's a good chunk of people watching this video who would be on both sides of this issue. There's a good amount who would agree with that statement, a good other amount who would say that's ridiculous, and then maybe a third group of people who think that neither perspective is right and missing the point, and that the people dressed in the MAGA hats and waving Trump signs were actually plants from Antifa. Now, I don't want to spend this time debating whether or not a Biden-Harris presidency is going to lead to the end of American democracy and the beginning of socialism, or if their presidency will lead to the end of religious freedom. I don't claim to be able to predict the future, and people who think that they can predict it are usually wrong. But I do want to speak to this issue as a pastor, and I want to try and answer one specific question. When Christianity or the Christian way of life is under attack, what should be the response of Christians? And can a Christian response ever include violence? Let's imagine for a second that the worst case scenario for those who are marching is true. Imagine that Biden and Harris will end democracy as we know it, and their presidency will force churches underground at threat of legitimate persecution, maybe even imprisonment. Imagine that the worst fears of every person who stormed into the Capitol were correct and that this would have been the very last chance to prevent any of it from happening. If all that was true, what would Jesus have thought as he looked down on the march into the Capitol? Would he be nodding approvingly? Would he be saddened by all the Christians who didn't have the courage to take action to drive up to DC? I don't claim to speak for Jesus, but I believe that the Bible gives us some potential ways to answer this question. If you look, you can find examples of violence being used by followers of God in the Bible. In the Old Testament, the first half, there was a people group known as the Moabites. They were worried that Israel, which was God's people, would try to conquer them. The Moabites didn't think that they could win in an actual war, so they sent their women in to try to seduce the Israelites into worshiping their gods. This is sort of like when other countries can't match the power of America's military, so instead they use social media to try to create internal disruption. And it worked. The Israelites started worshiping other gods and started a rebellion against God. God then sends this plague on the people, but they still don't change their ways. And so one man brings one of the women into his tent to sleep with her, basically out and open in front of everyone. And a different man named Phineas sees what's about to happen, and he grabs a spear and runs over and drives it straight through both the man and the woman. And in this violent act, the rebellion ends. Now, we could spend an entire video just talking about this event because it raises a lot of questions for you probably. But the most important aspect for our conversation is how the Apostle Paul would have viewed this event. Centuries later, in the time of Jesus, there was a group of Jews known as the Zealots, and Phineas, the man with the spear, was their hero. They believed that he was the example that in some cases, violence is necessary to defend religion. At this point in Israel's history, the Jews were under control by the Roman Empire, and the Zealots would advocate violence in order to gain political freedom. Now, Paul himself, who wrote a lot of the Bible, at this point in his life, he was not a card-carrying zealot, but he did have a lot of zealot in him. And so when this new movement called Christianity started, Paul saw it as an immediate threat to his own Jewish way of life. The Christians were claiming that this guy Jesus was Lord, which was a direct challenge to the Roman belief that Caesar was Lord. And remember, the Romans were the ones who were in charge. And to make things worse, the early Christians were saying that what they believed was directly found in the Jewish scriptures. And so if Christianity grew, it might get the attention of the Romans as the start of a new rebellion. And so Paul was worried that Rome might see all this and respond by just wiping out all the Christians and the Jews at once. Do you see how this situation has parallels to the situation today? There's a direct attack on Paul's religious way of life, so much so that it could threaten his freedom to practice the religion openly. And so Paul did what the Zealots would do, what Phineas would have done. He took violent action. We read this in the book of Acts. Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off men and women and put them in prison. And Paul could point back to biblical scriptures to back this up. He could say, I'm doing what the Bible tells me to do. I need to defend the faith, even if it means using violence, just like Phineas did. And for all the people who stormed the Capitol and legitimately believed that the election had been unlawfully stolen from a man that God had appointed to preserve the influence of Christianity in this country, the threat would feel very similar to the threat that Paul was fearing. To the people breaking in, they were making a last-ditch effort to stop a Democrat-controlled a government from increasing abortions and closing down churches. And when every lawful political channel had failed to stop this from happening, there was only one response left. Someone zealous needed to step up and pick up the spear. And so people got on buses and they headed to DC to make one last attempt at saving Christianity from destruction in their minds. Now, remember what I asked when we started. Imagine that every single one of these claims is true. Imagine that every single thing that these people are worried about happening will actually happen. If that's true, was the response at the Capitol justified? Now, when Paul started persecuting Christians, look at how the Christians responded. Saul was going everywhere to destroy the church. He went from house to house, dragging out both men and women to throw them into prison. But the believers who were scattered preached the good news about Jesus wherever they went. Here you have Paul using violence to try and stop a threat against his religion. And what was the Christian response? They flee for their lives and continue to preach the message of Jesus while they run. They don't band together and respond with violence to save their religion. The violence against them actually fuels their evangelism. When there's a legitimate threat against a religion, whose response was right? Paul's or the Christians'? The Bible gives us the answer, and ironically, it comes from Paul himself. The most famous moment in Paul's life was the moment that he realized he had been wrong. The reason that there's churches around the world that read the letters of Paul was not because of his violence, but because of his repentance. If you don't know the story, you can read about it in Acts chapter 9. Paul has this miraculous vision where the resurrected Jesus speaks to him directly, and the message completely reframes how he understood the way God's kingdom would be established and preserved through the death and resurrection of Jesus. Paul realizes that violence is not the answer to the threats against the church. And then he devotes his entire life to evangelism. Every time he's on the verge of being killed for believing in Jesus, he does what the Christians did when he was attacking them. He flees and keeps telling people about Jesus wherever he goes. Do you see the significance of this? Once Paul had had an encounter with Jesus, it's not like the threat against his religion went away. It actually continued to intensify. And yet now he realized that the kingdom of God wouldn't and couldn't be saved through military action or violence, but through love and humility and suffering. The hero of Christianity is Jesus, who would rather let himself be killed than fight back. When he's on trial to be executed, he says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." Jesus could have used force to bring about his kingdom, but that would create a different kind of kingdom than what he desired. He wanted to make a new group of people who were characterized by love, humility, peace, and sacrifice for the sake of other people. And if he began that kingdom with bloodshed, it never could become what it was meant to become. When you look over the history of the Christian church, it's always at its very best when it follows the way of Jesus rather than this violent way of Paul before he had his change of heart. In the 1970s, when the church in China was being heavily persecuted and churches and seminaries were being closed and pastors were being jailed, the church went underground and exploded in numbers. And right now, the fastest growing Christian church isn't in the mega churches of America, it's in Iran, and it's underground under the threat of imprisonment and death. If there were ever times when it seemed like the violence is sometimes necessary argument, it would have been in the early Christian days or in China or in Iran. Yet the people knew that this wasn't the way of Jesus. And so we need to realize that God's church doesn't need our military protection or violent intervention. It is a fact of history that the church grows fastest and strongest when it is heavily persecuted. Now, it's important to note that this doesn't mean we can't use our political freedoms to fight for Christianity while we have them. Several times in Paul's life, he's about to be killed, and he appeals to his status as a Roman citizen in order to avoid being executed. It's not wrong to protest or to vote certain ways, but the moment that we move from political action and peaceful protests to violent actions, we no longer can claim to be following Jesus, no matter how many Bibles we are carrying.